Hello, ladies and gentlemen of On the Line. Today you have Jen Gerson, and with me today is Dave Cournoyer, the leader and writer of daveberta. And if you know anything about Alberta politics, you'll know that this guy is the go-to on the ins and outs of Alberta politics going back 20 odd years. We talked to Dave today about the rise of Western separatism, what the rest of Canada should be doing to respond. We talk about Danielle Smith and the scandals besetting her government, and the perennial question that I'm going to pose to any progressive blogger in this province: where in the hell is Naheed Nenshi? Join us on the line with Jen Gerson. With me today, Dave Cournoyer.
This message is brought to you by the Métis Nation of Ontario. It's Abitibi River, Northern Ontario, in 1854. They called it the Long Portage. From the banks of the Abitibi River, Métis voyageurs hauled heavy freight canoes and Hudson's Bay Company trade goods across miles of forest and muskeg. Their hard work linked Fort Albany and Moose Factory along the James Bay coast with Lake Timiskaming, and from there, the entire Northwest. As the HBC moved inland from Moose Factory to open and work at posts to the south and west, the Métis factory boys and their families cut the trail, built the storehouse, and ran the trade. They were the guides, interpreters, diplomats, and entrepreneurs, and they endured. The Métis remained in Northern Ontario and in the story of how this country was built, because Canada is not Canada without the Métis. Today, Métis rights are a settled fact of law in Ontario. This Indigenous Peoples Month, visit OntarioMétisFacts.com to learn more.
All right, ladies and gentlemen of On the Line, today we have Dave Cournoyer. Dave, how do I describe you other than saying that you are a longtime Alberta political observer, writer? You write daveberta.com, and I think that we can describe you fairly and safely to our audience as a terrible lefty and scourge upon the land of the clean, pure, conservative homeland of Alberta. Is that all reasonable and accurate?
From that scourge of a lefty city known as Edmonton, Alberta.
Oh, the worst. Well, I'm here talking to you down from Calgary, of course, so the weather is better and everything's nicer. We do feel bad for you up there, but
it's plenty smoky up here for everyone. So
well, that's fair. So how long? Let's start right off the top. How long have you actually been writing about Alberta politics now? Because I know you were doing it when I just started talking about Alberta politics.
Yeah, I launched daveberta. Actually, it was daveberta.blogspot.com was the original site. And I launched it in January of 2005. So this year is actually my 20th year writing about Alberta politics online. It was a few years after that I transitioned to daveberta.ca. I actually had a real professional website. It was WordPress. And then 2 or 3 years ago, I moved over to Substack, where I now write about Alberta politics, host the Daveberta podcast, and people are invited to come and subscribe. And I've been getting a lot of, actually, it's been a really interesting platform to use, and I've actually quite enjoyed it. It's quite interactive, and you get to have a lot of interaction with the readers on, not necessarily only in the comment section, but like in an email basis. So I get a lot of readers who email me back, and I have some really great discussions with it. So it makes it a lot more engaging than kind of trying to weed through the comment section all the time.
Yeah, it's an interesting. It's a fairly clean interface, and it does make it really easy for writers to just kind of plow forward. So, look, does it make you feel a little bit old to talk about the fact that you've been writing about? I mean, you're quite in depth. Your blog really is, if you're a political watcher, a bit of a must read, because you get into the personalities, you get into the dynamics. You're quite thorough in the way that you approach Alberta politics. But does it make you feel a tiny bit ancient to think that you've been writing about this for 20 years?
Yes, the answer is yes. I do feel ancient. Sometimes, I mean, I definitely don't feel as young as, I'm not old, but I definitely don't feel as young as I used to. And looking back, I was looking at kind of drafting right now, kind of a review post for the past 20 years, celebrating 20 years of daveberta, and looking back at when I started writing about Alberta politics, just how different the political landscape was. I mean, Ralph Klein was still Premier of Alberta. He was in his second last year or third last year as Premier. So it was kind of the dying days of the Klein era. The Liberals were the official opposition with about a dozen or so seats, and the NDP had 2 or 4 seats. And I think Danielle Smith was still a TV host or something at that point. So this is a lot has changed in Alberta politics over the past 20 years, and in like a real profound way. And I mean, we've had 2 changes of government since then is like a pretty huge thing when you look at the context of Alberta politics, where we're used to these dynasties that go for 20, 30, 40 years before changing. And, in the past 10 years, we've had government change twice. So that's, there's been a lot that's happened really in the past 10 years, but it's a different dynamic in Alberta politics these days. And I mean, not just politics, but our province has changed. The province is fundamentally a different place than it was 20 years ago. And, part of that is because we've grown so much, and then the population is different, and, our cities are bigger, our small towns are bigger. And with that, the politics of things change.
Well, it's an interesting thing because when I first started writing about Alberta politics, or when I first came to, I was kind of born here. When I first came back to Alberta, I came back in 2010, and like politics was considered the beat of death, right? like it was like, okay, dry policy announcement. Occasionally, Ralph Klein said something crazy, and that was that. There really was. I mean, the elections were not exciting. I think that's safe to say.
Mm-hmm.
And I took my first job at the National Post in 2012. And all of a sudden, I did not run out of things to 2012, and that's I did not run out of things to talk about or write about. Politics went from just being this was a wasteland in terms of political reporting and writing. I mean, the people were fantastic who did it, but I mean,
mm-hmm.
the drama just wasn't there. To all of a sudden, like Alison Redford comes to power, and like it's nonstop volatility. Every year, every 2 years, there's some kind of major drama, there's some kind of major spill, there's something weird happening.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, I kind of picked my perfect moment to take on a role at a national newspaper in a provincial bureau, because I think that if I had come to that particular job 10 years before, I would have no public profile. No one would care because you're working in the hinterland. But I came into that job in 2012, just as things tick off, and everybody in Canada's got their eyes glued to what the hell is going on in Alberta. This went from being a really, really boring province where it was very unlikely as a journalist that you could really build a strong national profile to being the best province to be if you're trying to build a strong national profile, because everybody was paying attention to what was happening here. I kind of want to get into that a little bit, but firstly, I just want to give our audience members who may not be familiar what the lay of the land is in politics now. What are the big stories? What are the big themes that are occurring in politics now? And then I think we can probably dig back into the history of all of that, because it is a never-ending soap opera.
Yes. And, in Alberta politics, there's never, as you said, at one point, Alberta politics might have been considered boring. Of course, I've never actually considered Alberta politics boring. It's always interesting if you know where to look. And I think that, before we started having real competitive elections in this province, really starting in 2015, when the NDP, to everyone's shock and awe and surprise, mostly to the New Democrats themselves, won the 2015 election. We've had competitive electoral politics in this province. Before then, we had competitive politics, but a lot of that happened internally inside the Progressive Conservative Party that had governed Alberta for 43 years when it was defeated in 2015 and then dissolved shortly after that. But really, looking at the political playing field in Alberta, 2015 is really kind of where the big things changed. And, going into the elections before that, 2012, even in a bit in 2008, there was a desire for change. Albertans, there was a taste for some kind of electoral change. In 2008 and 2012, the Progressive Conservatives were really able to capture that momentum, capture that mantle of change. I mean, I was thinking back the other day of the Progressive Conservative Party's re-election slogan in 2008 was "Change you can trust." I think is what it was, and they were really, it was Obama had been elected in the United States or was about to be elected. There was a real change momentum, and the PCs were able to capture that. And in 2012, they changed leaders again, and Alison Redford was able to capture a lot of that change momentum in facing a big challenge from Danielle Smith, who was leading the Wild Rose Party. And then in 2015, everything just tipped over, and the NDP were able to run the board and form a majority government. So really, those kind of 3 elections really helped shape where we are in Alberta politics now. It wasn't long after the 2015 election that the Progressive Conservatives and the Wild Rose Party, some people would call it, a lot of people would call it a merger, some people would call it a hostile takeover, but the two parties merged, Jason Kenney became leader, and then was able to win in the 2019 election. I'm not going to give a huge history of Alberta politics, but essentially COVID happened. The UCP had entered 2019 with a fairly aggressive political agenda. And the one thing they didn't count on, or that no one could really predict, was that there would be a global pandemic that would happen. And that really helped undercut Premier Jason Kenney and his leadership. And then Danielle Smith came out of the ashes of a political career that had dissipated in 2014 and 2015. And, she spent good 6 or 7 years on talk radio, rebuilding her connection with a lot of Albertans. And that was able to...
and building her lists, too.
And building her lists. That's exactly it. And there was a lot of stuff that was going on. And, and it was interesting when Danielle Smith decided to run for the leadership. There a lot of political observers, myself included, were saying, well, she doesn't have a chance. Conservatives won't forgive her for what she did when she crossed the floor in 2014. But
I thought she was toast. I didn't think she was going to have a comeback.
Yeah, exactly. But she had been out of the kind of official political realm, and she'd been out there building her lists. She'd had a very active page on locals.com. She had a very active newsletter. She was on the radio. And she became a familiar voice for a lot of Albertans. And especially during the COVID pandemic, she became a familiar voice and a trusted voice for a lot of Albertans who were very skeptical and opposed the COVID public health restrictions and had skepticisms about vaccines. And she rode a wave into the UCP leadership. And I guess that's kind of where we are now. The NDP did very well in the 2023 election. Rachel Notley tried to accomplish something that had never been accomplished in Alberta politics again. She tried to have a comeback as premier. The NDP did very well. They won. I think they got about 44% of the vote. They made big gains in Calgary, but it wasn't enough to form government. So where we are now is...
Well, and the other thing to say is, I mean, well and not well. Conservatives are now having exactly the same conversation about how well Pierre Poilievre did, right? I mean, it wasn't good enough, but it was gains, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think Notley made some pretty crucial mistakes in that election, and I actually think she could have won that election. Focusing on things like corporate taxes, for example, was not the winning ticket.
No.
And I was actually shocked by how should I say this, and how not aggressive the NDP was toward Danielle Smith in some of her history interviews. I was shocked. I thought they were going to go much harder on her than they did. Yeah, that was just my top line take.
Yeah, no, they ran. I think they ran a fairly mild mannered and safe campaign, and
they did.
They picked their path, and if the NDP would have won, it would have always been a narrow path to victory. There's only so many real urban seats, and then a handful of small city seats that they could have won. But I think there definitely were, strategic errors and missteps and choices made in that campaign. And but they had their shot.
They shot their shot. And I have no actually I don't. It seems fairly impolite now to be harsh toward Rachel Notley. I mean, Rachel Notley did her service. She was premier of the province, and she ran several times and she put her name forward. That's really tough for anybody in politics. So my general policy is, once someone's out of politics, you have to speak well of the dead. You know what I mean? Like, I know it's a terrible way of phrasing it, but she's not. No, and nor am I wishing ill on her in any way. But I do kind of feel like once somebody's stepped back from public life, you kind of have to be a little bit respectful of the service that they had. I don't know if this seems almost superstitious of me, maybe. But anyway, look, so I think it's safe to say that the UCP did not win the last election with the overwhelming majority that I think they would have wanted or expected. And I think that Danielle Smith's tenure as premier has had some ups and downs, but it's been very, very rocky. I don't know if you just want to give us just a quick overview on some of the major controversies of the premiership so far, and some of the accomplishments what would you list of both accomplishments of her tenure so far, and what are some of the major controversies that you would list?
Yeah, I mean, I think just going back to if I could just quickly touch on your point about the UCP winning as many seats as they wanted to. I going through the last provincial election, and since, I always think back to this interview that Danielle Smith did with Rick Bell in, I think it was December 2022. And it was Bell published a column in the Calgary Sun, and it was basically Danielle Smith saying, we don't need to win. We don't need to win all of Calgary. We can afford to lose seats if that means that we shore up our support in the rural areas and the small cities. And of course, when that interview was published, there were a whole bunch of UCP MLAs in Calgary who kind of raised their hand and said, whoa, that's my job.
Yeah.
You're willing to sacrifice me. And then she backtracked on it publicly. But really, that was the play, was the UCP knew that they could afford to lose a number of seats in Calgary to the NDP. But as long as they held the line with, 6 or 7 seats in Calgary and were able to hold the line in one of the seats in Lethbridge and around the Edmonton area, then they could still form government. I don't know that for this particular term in government that the UCP really, of course, every party would love to win a whole bunch of seats, but winning a whole bunch of seats doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have an effective government. When you win a massive majority, as Ralph Klein discovered in 2001 and as Ed Stelmach discovered after 2008, you have to find work for a lot of backbenchers. There's a lot of backbenchers with, twiddling their thumbs who think they should be cabinet ministers and think they should be doing important work. So managing a large caucus is challenging. So I don't think for this term in government, obviously they would be thrilled to win a lot of seats, but I think for this term in government, when you look at some of the more radical, divisive agenda items that Danielle Smith's UCP is putting forward, I think a smaller caucus of more like-minded people, more like-minded conservatives actually fits their agenda well.
So Dave, that's a really interesting point about how sometimes a more unified rural caucus might actually lead to a more unified and easier to manage caucus, particularly when you're dealing with the province o poisoned chalices for all conservative movements. All ye who dare come in be warned, here there be dragons. But on the flip side to that, Danielle Smith herself has openly now claimed that part of the reason why she supports, playing footsie with the Western separatists and has even passed or proposed legislation that would make it easier for the separatists to force a referendum on the province is because she fears that if she doesn't, even that supposedly rural unified caucus will split on her. Do you have some? I'm not in Edmonton, but is there any validity to that concern that the existing caucus would split?
Well, I think that there are some MLAs in the UCP caucus who have very strong feelings about Alberta's place in Canada. And obviously we have, as we've seen, there are some people very influential people within the UCP who have very strong feelings about Alberta separatism. This is kind of the difference between past Alberta separatist efforts and the current one is, there's always been 2 or 3 or 4, or sometimes even 5 or 6 small fringe right-wing separatist parties in Alberta. We have this kind of cottage economy of kind of fringe right-wing fringe parties in this province that together maybe gather around 1 or 2, or maybe in a good year for them 3% of the vote in a general election. But what we've seen now is that the push for separatism, or the push for a vote on Alberta separatism from Canada, is coming from inside the UCP. You have folks like Mitch Sylvestre, who is the president of the UCP Association in Bonnyville, Cold Lake, Lac La Biche, or Bonnyville, Cold Lake, St. Paul, pardon me, who's, which is one of the most active UCP constituency associations in the province. Every year at the UCP AGM, they take a big photo and brag about being, having the most delegates come to the AGM. They're one of the best fundraising constituency associations in the province. You have folks like Dennis Modry, who tried to run for a UCP nomination in the last election, who's involved. Jeff Rath, who's been involved in the UCP and gone to AGM. So, the people behind groups like the Alberta Prosperity Project, Take Back Alberta, the groups that are really pushing for and collect out there right now, trying to collect signatures or preparing to collect signatures to force a referendum on Alberta separation next year. These are voices from within the UCP. This is inside Danielle Smith's coalition. So this isn't necessarily a group that she can just ignore and say, oh, well, that's the disgruntled Conservative Party and they're going to get about 10 votes in the next election. No, these are people who could really cause difficulty for her and could cause her grief in internal party politics if she doesn't listen to them. And I think that's why the Premier is paying so much attention to this. And she's straddling this line, right? Like she's toying with the separatists and she's appeasing them. One of the first things that the UCP government did after the federal election on April 28th was lower
yeah.
the threshold of the number of signatures required to force a referendum vote, a province-wide referendum vote, knowing full well that this group was already had already said that they were planning on doing that. So, she's making it easier for these groups to get out and organize and force this kind of vote. So I think that's the big difference, is she's playing this game of, she's toying with the separatists and appeasing them, and then also playing the I'm standing up for Alberta role as premier. And it's a fine line to walk, because those are two very different, even though she's trying to walk a middle line, she's not trying to be, she's saying she's pro-Canada, but she's pro-strong Alberta within United Canada.
She's pro-strong Alberta within all of her statements around these issues are Rorschach tests.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Like, you can see exactly what you want to see. If you want to see someone who is standing up for Alberta against a hostile Canada, but is nonetheless still a federalist, you'll see that in her comments. Yeah. And if you want to see implicit wink nudge support for separatism, you'll read exactly the same thing into those kinds of comments.
Yeah. So it's, this is a tricky position for her, and it's a dangerous position for her politically, because things could turn around pretty quick. If once we, it looks like at this point that we will have some kind of referendum next year. It's highly likely we will have some kind of referendum on Alberta separatism. No one's quite sure what the question will be. But where does she go during that campaign? Who does she campaign for? When it's less of, when there's no gray area, when it's a yes or no question, then she's going to be forced to pick sides, or it's going to be very difficult for her not to pick sides. That said, she is a skilled communicator, and she's a very shrewd politician. So if anybody could figure out how to wiggle out of that, it's probably Danielle Smith. But there are going to be a lot of Albertans and a lot of people in her own party who are proud Canadians and proud Canadian conservatives who are, going to demand and expect that the leader take a position. And the people who are on the other side, who are separatists and going to be supporting the separatist side of the referendum, are also going to be pushing her to support them as well.
I also think there's a significant contingent of the Western separatists who really do believe, who are the Western separatists, who aren't actually separatists at all. They literally just believe that if we can kick up enough of a fuss, if we can threaten a referendum, Ottawa will have to concede to all of our demands.
Yeah.
But the problem with that is that, okay, but all your leverage disappears the second the vote is over.
Yes.
Right? And you're assuming on either way.
Yeah, and you're assuming that there's going to be a sympathetic, receptive audience outside of Canada, outside of Alberta, who is going to, you're assuming that you are playing from that they're assuming they're playing from a position of strength, which
that's right.
And that, to your point, that strength kind of disappears right away.
Well, and also I can't tell you how many memes I've seen about this idea that the second Alberta leaves, it'll be Ottawa and Quebec living on the streets because they're going to be so impoverished without our wealth. And I'm like, I don't know if you've looked at the math on that one. The landlocked province with the high GDP is nonetheless far more dependent on the one single resource. We're probably not going to be in the position of strength that you think we are if this referendum actually proves to go forward. And if the referendum fails, which I think is the highest probability, your leverage is gone right off the bat.
Yeah, and I mean, it doesn't solve. I mean, there's some fantastical ideas out there that people have who are supporting this about how it's going to save Alberta $700 billion a year or something like that. And, all these, they throw around these numbers. If you go on Instagram, there's just an absolute wealth of AI-generated cartoon images about Alberta separatism. Someone is out there just pumping requests and queries into AI image generators, putting this stuff out. But really, Albertans have grievances. A lot of them are legitimate. A lot of them are perceived or historical. But Alberta separating from Canada isn't going to solve most of the big grievances that we have. I mean, the biggest one is at least lately, is talking about pipelines. Well, if you think it's difficult to build a pipeline from Alberta to the coast, to Pacific Coast in British Columbia now, when we're one country, just wait till we're two countries. Then they don't even have to listen to us. But I mean, it seems like but Mark Carney.
But aren't you aware that the UN will force them to give us tidewater access, Dave?
Yes, the United Nations will do that.
Yeah, the United Nations will okay. I mean, this is the thing that I just find really, really frustrating when you're talking to these guys, because if you want to have a serious conversation about independence and the benefits and the drawbacks thereof, okay, let's have a serious conversation. But the problem that I have with a lot of this stuff is people can just make up whatever the hell they want, and people will hear what they want to hear.
Yeah.
So if we separate from Alberta, the value of the money you've saved will double, or all of a sudden, or the value of your income will double, or your taxes will be halved. People can just make whatever claim they want. It doesn't matter if it's rooted in fact. It doesn't matter if people like you or me will point out, it's like, okay, but in what dollar?
Yeah.
Or if we were to get rid of the federal government, we'd have to replicate services and probably more expensively.
Yep.
But if you have those sorts of like, okay, yeah, but people are just like, well, you're fear mongering. What are you talking about? Or the other thing that I see people responding on separatism is that when people like Jason Kenney will poo-poo separatism on places like Twitter, and basically say things like, even if you hold a successful referendum, that doesn't necessarily mean you get to dictate the terms of what a separation agreement looks like with Canada. You're not necessarily going to have control over the things that you want to keep and don't want to keep.
Yeah.
He's accused of fear mongering. This is fear mongering. We'll be able to separate from Canada while keeping all the benefits of being in Canada, and if you say otherwise, you're fear mongering. I mean,
well, reality is frightening sometimes.
I mean, these aren't rational conversations. These are LARPs. These are wish fulfillments.
Yeah.
And that's what I find them really frustrating, is that they're not even serious conversations. And the idea, from my perspective, that Danielle Smith would be entertaining this level of debate or legitimizing it, which I believe that she is with her actions, to me, it's horrific. It's really, really horrific.
Yeah, no, this has gone from a fringe thing to an almost mainstream thing.
Yeah,
in terms of just the attention it's been given. It's, you have the Premier of Alberta.
That's right.
Using her pulpit, her position as the Premier of this province to further the political pursuit of Alberta independence from Canada. Whether she's saying fully that she's supporting it or not, that's what she's doing with her actions, by simply legitimizing it.
Yeah, and hasn't she also sort of commissioned Preston Manning to do a study on this?
Well, I don't know if Manning has been commissioned. I know that they are going to hold another kind of fair deal panel, another version of the fair deal panel. I know that the Premier's office has recently hired Bill Buick as a senior advisor on federal affairs, and I expect that Bill, who's knows a lot about federal-provincial relations. He was right in the middle of the equalization debate in the referendum we had a few years ago.
Which was very effective, I can tell.
Yeah, exactly. Equalization was fixed, right? I mean, it's funny when you have these conversations about Alberta separatism and these grievances, and we don't realize that, and people just forget conveniently that we had this referendum like 4 years ago, and nothing ever really came of it because.
Yeah. And people like me were writing at the time basically saying holding a referendum that has no factual value is only going to get people more and more riled up because it's going to set expectations that you can't fulfill.
Yeah.
And lo and behold. So look, one of the things that I think is really interesting about the separatism dynamic is I want to get into a conversation about how seriously other people in the rest of Canada should take this. But first I want to make this really interesting observation, and that is even among people who are sort of loosely supportive of the idea of Alberta separation or are willing to entertain the thought, when you actually start to dig into it and say, okay, so do you want to have your own pension policy? Do you want to have your own police force? Do we want to have our own military? How do you want to do immigration? How do you want to do the actual mechanics of separation or the actual mechanics of independence when the policies are considered one-on-one are horrifically unpopular.
Yeah.
There's a reason why all of the previous fair deal panels have come up with all of these ideas about ways Alberta could be more independent, copying and taking from the Quebec model. We could collect our own taxes. We could have our own police force. We could do all these things. But when any provincial government has tried to implement any of these things, these policies die in the vine because all of a sudden people look at the details and being like, yeah, we could collect our own taxes, but that would actually cost us a lot more to do because we don't have economies of scale and the federal government kind of does that for us and it actually saves us money. Or they'll look at things like the Alberta pension plan and they'll be like, great, but who's going to be in charge of the Alberta pension plan and how are they going to be investing Alberta's funds?
Yeah.
And did we maybe want to mention that the Canadian pension plan actually has a pretty good performance record and comparable investment portfolios like AIMCO really don't? Or rural municipalities have been up in arms about a provincial police force. They're like, you should be holding a referendum about this. And I think that one of the great hypocrisies of all of this is that Danielle Smith is playing this role as the great Democrat, saying, I support democracy and votes, except on the policies that she knows are doomed to fail, like, or are really unpopular, like pension plans and police forces.
Yeah.
So we're totally cool having a conversation potentially blowing up the country and splitting up the provinces, but on the much lesser mechanics of how independent Alberta would have to function, no, we can't let the people have a vote on that. I just find that dynamic totally fascinating, but can you explain it to me?
Well, I think once you get into the details of it, you mentioned the Alberta pension plan. The Alberta government did a huge consultation on, over the course of a year. They had Jim Dinning chair this consultation panel that traveled around the province. They held telephone town halls. And they found out pretty quickly that Albertans didn't really want a provincial pension plan. They were happy with the Canada pension plan, or probably more likely they didn't want politicians messing with their retirement security. As we all pay into CPP, and we're pretty happy with the returns, and they didn't really see a need to play politics with it. And that the Alberta government hasn't really talked about the Alberta pension plan in about a year. It says a lot about how Albertans felt about it. I think that when you talk about how Albertans react to the details of it, when you actually start asking questions, I think that for the separatists to be successful or to have some success, I think they believe it needs to be an emotional argument. I don't think once you get into the details, people are going to be, I'm not happy with Ottawa, or maybe I don't like the Liberals, but I'm happy with Canada because it's a pretty good place and we got a great deal here and it's a really good place to live. And out of all Canada, Alberta's a pretty good place to be in Canada. But making those emotional arguments and stirring up the grievance politics, I think is what really, really drives this. And I think that, one thing that, the Alberta government and Alberta separatists talk a lot, and they compare Alberta a lot to Quebec in this argument, in this debate. And they say, well, we want what Quebec wants, and we want what Quebec wants. And look what Quebec did, having separation referendums, and this is all the stuff they got. Well, Quebec had some of that stuff before the separation referendums. And, there's a long history behind that. The biggest thing being the language difference. But Quebec was never in the Canada pension plan from the very beginning. They decided to have their own pension plan, and any other province could have at the time too. But I think the one thing we don't talk about is the divisiveness of separation referendums when it comes to societally, and how absolutely divisive it has been in Quebec when they had the referendum in 1980, when they had the referendum in 1995. These are, families weren't talking to each other. There was social, I don't want to say social strife, but there was social, there was disconnection made. There was a lot of social cost in terms of how divisive an argument, because it is something that is passionate. People, if you want Alberta to separate, and you're willing to advocate out there and advocate for it, you're pretty passionate about it. And there's a lot of people who are going to be very passionate. A majority of people who are going to be very passionate about Alberta staying in Canada. And, there's going to be families that are broken up over this and friendships that end over this, because it is a real fundamental issue, cultural issue, political issue that we're going to be asked to vote for on the ballot. And I don't think that we are ready for what comes after that, just in terms of how this is going to change Alberta and change how we interact with each other as Albertans.
Yeah, because even if the other thing that I'm slightly concerned about this referendum, firstly, there's nothing when people from the east, the middle part, talk to me about how seriously should we be taking this referendum. I never know quite how to answer that, because numerically, the numbers of people who are willing to entertain this are not fringe, but they're not quite in the mainstream either. I think that among the separatists themselves, the polling shows that there's a pretty wide range of people that range everywhere from, if we just do this, we'll get leverage, to I want to join the 51st state, to I want some kind of vision of Cascadia that's not on offer, to I want to be an independent Alberta, but I still want all the benefits of being in Canada. Nothing will really change if we do this, right? Yeah. And all of that gets lumped into this number that seems quite big on the surface of people who are interested in this. But nothing really puts the lie to the seeming size of that interest and the solidarity of that group than the fact that there's almost no appetite for the actual mechanics of independence. Like, we can already do most of the things, I think all of the things that Quebec can do. We have the same provincial rights that Quebec has, but we've consistently declined to do many of these things for ourselves because we've looked at the math in it and said, So, like, is a province full of people who are actually pretty about this actually stoked up to enough to actually overcome the obstacles of becoming an independent nation? The concern that I actually have about all of this is that something similar to what will happen during Brexit will happen. You're going to have a total overwhelm of absolutely unmoored and unhinged promises. You're going to have every single skeptical voice about those promises yelled down by people who accuse us of fear mongering or being pro-Ottawa traitors or whatever. And then my fear is that you're going to have just enough people going into the ballot box saying, well, I don't really want to separate from Canada, but it sure would send a message to Ottawa. And, enough people do that, and now we have a constitutional crisis and a national crisis on our hands that people don't actually really want to deal with. Right? That's my fear going in, and this is why I think that humoring this stuff is so irresponsible and so dangerous. Because if you go into these questions, and maybe there's 20% people who are passionately committed to an independent Alberta, but there's 30% of people who are just pissed off at Ottawa and just want to send a message. There's 50% right there, right? And like that's my fear about where this goes. Also, let's have a conversation about why direct democracy is bad.
No kidding. No kidding. I mean, this is the campaigns matter. Is we don't know what form this referendum campaign is going to take on. I mean, obviously there's going to be a ballot question. There'll be two sides. We don't know who's going to be the pro-Canada side and who's going to be the Alberta separatism side. But we also don't know what issues are really what they're going to focus on, or whether they're going to focus on issues that resonate with Albertans. And so that the ballot question, even though it may be written, should Alberta separate from Canada or something like that people may show up at the ballot thinking something differently or having a different ballot question in mind. And I think that's a good point that you're making about how this should be taken seriously. And it's easy to kind of mock and make fun of Alberta separatists because some of the ideas they're proposing are fantastical and don't actually make any sense. But they are a political force, and they are out there organizing, and they're out there holding town hall meetings and collecting signatures and rallying their troops. And they also have a significant amount of political influence within the governing political party here in Alberta. And I mean, that's the big difference between, when you look at this is a issue for conservatives in Alberta. When you look at I think it was I can't remember who it was it Leger or it was Abacus, or I can't remember. One of the polling companies came out with some polling that basically asked Albertans, who would you vote for in the next provincial election? And they split it up between the NDP and the UCP because those are the main two political parties. And then they asked those voters, how would you vote in a referendum on Alberta separation? And something like 97 or 98% of NDP voters in Alberta said they would vote to stay in Canada. It was much more split in the UCP. I think it was like 58 or 60% of UCP voters said that they would vote to separate. So this is very much an issue that's happening on the political right here in Alberta. And I think unlike Quebec, and of course I'm not an expert in Quebec politics, but I do know that the Federalists and the Sovereigntists and Separatists in Quebec, there is a left-right spectrum in both those groups. And in Alberta politics, there is no, I'd like to meet those 3% of NDP voters who want to separate from Canada. I think it's a margin of error in the polling, but it really is an issue on the political right. And that's why Danielle Smith is paying so much attention to it.
Well, but the problem is that it will continue to be an issue on the political right as long as its leaders permit it to allow it and permit it to fester and grow and become an issue.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So here's the other question I have is, if somebody from the other parts of the country, the other parts of New Canada, come to you and say, Dave, how seriously are you taking the separatists? How seriously are you taking this threat? Well, what's your answer to that? I never know what the answer to give to that.
I mean, that's a hard question because I don't think that, all the polling shows, and I don't believe that a referendum would be for Alberta to leave Canada would be successful. I think there'd be a strong opposition to it and strong support for staying in Canada. But I do think it is something to take seriously. I mean, they are out there. The separatist groups like the Alberta Prosperity Project are out there holding town halls. They're attracting people to come. A lot of this is largely in the rural areas, but that's also the governing party's base of support is rural Alberta. Mm-hmm. And that's what their MLAs and the cabinet ministers are going to be hearing from. So I do think it's something to take seriously. Not that it would be successful, but that if it's not seriously opposed, and if the case isn't seriously made during a referendum to stay in Canada, that it could, even if it fails, could become a permanent political force here in Alberta. And I think that's something that's bad for Alberta and bad for Canada.
What should the rest of Canada be doing right now?
Well, not actively annoying Alberta is probably the best part to do. Not that a lot of Canada actually does that. I'm thinking more particularly a handful of cabinet ministers in Ottawa who kind of seem to go out of their way sometimes to annoy Conservatives in Alberta. It's probably not the most helpful thing to do anytime, but especially not now after they've just won, after the Liberals have just been reelected. But no, I think that Prime Minister Carney should take a look at the list of 9 or 10 demands that Danielle Smith proposed. Seriously look, there is going to be some theatrical elements of the Trudeau agenda that can probably be removed. There's some serious legislation around climate change and around energy and environmental regulation that we probably need to keep as a country, but there's also theatrics that we can probably remove. I think a tone change is probably the biggest thing. Because once you start playing this game of, we'll remove this legislation and this federal legislation, well, Danielle Smith is going to come up with a list of another 10 or 12 pieces of legislation that she wants the federal government to remove. So, you could obviously take it seriously, work with the Premier because she is the Premier of Alberta. But I think a tone change is really important. And I think that one of the things that's really frustrated me as someone who comes from a more progressive political leaning is how I think over the past 10 years, there have been, I think I speak specifically to the Trudeau government in Ottawa, there were people who I think fundamentally in that government, cabinet ministers and MPs, who fundamentally didn't understand Alberta. And they saw oil and gas as simply, it's simply an economic thing and that's it. Or it's simply a climate change thing. And they didn't really fully understand how much of a cultural role the energy industry plays in Alberta. And I mean, our hockey team in Edmonton is named the Oilers, it does play a big significant role. And I can just hear people in Ottawa guffawing and groaning at this, but there are a lot of Albertans blue class working Albertans who make a good living and have done very well in oil and gas and have done very well in the energy industry. And I'm not talking about the guys sitting in the C-suites and the big glass towers in downtown Calgary. Those guys are going to find a way to make big money regardless, and they're going to spend the rest of the year in Palm Springs. I'm talking about the guys who, the families who, work in Slave Lake, they work in Bonnyville, they're all around the province. And, because of these jobs they're able to get, it provides them opportunity. They can buy a nice house. They can go on a vacation maybe once, maybe twice a year with their family. They can help pay for their kids' university in ways that, we probably wouldn't be able to do if we were an agricultural-based province that didn't have oil and gas. Are there problems with the oil and gas industry? Yeah, absolutely. It's not perfect. Should we be taking climate change seriously? Yeah, all of a sudden I'm looking out my window here and it's smoky. We've had, my kids have had soccer games canceled over the past couple of weeks because there's too much wildfire smoke in the air. That's a serious problem. We should be talking about that. But you don't have to be, you have to understand the role that the energy industry plays in the lives of a lot of normal Albertans and the opportunity it's given them, and not, and understand what it means when you talk about, or you're perceived as saying you're going to shut down the oil industry, what that means for a lot of normal people who just want to live their lives and do well for their families.
Yeah, and the idea that the government is going to replace these with great, fantastic jobs that never materialize, right, or don't pay very well.
Exactly.
And as if most Albertans are really keen to become dependencies on the federal government. I think that's a really excellent point, and I'll share a bit of a personal background story that I think illustrates that point, and that is, I know I was raised by a single mom who worked in oil and gas. For basically my entire life. She worked for Shell, and worked her way up from a really, really junior position into a position that was actually very well paid and very senior. That kind of class and social mobility just doesn't exist outside of I'm not even sure if it even exists today in the oil sector, but there are very, very, very few industries now where someone with my mom's background in education could have gotten a job at a company, gone from a junior role to almost like basically self-taught engineering style role over the course of a 35 plus year career, retire very well with a good pension and able to raise a daughter on her own while doing that. There just aren't a lot of industries out there where those opportunities are available like that. And I think that's correct. The idea that these are just jobs and that doesn't matter, and that you can wave away all of these jobs and you're going to replace them with something that provides the same degree of stability and class mobility as oil and gas does right now and has previously in the recent past. That's a tough sell. That's a pretty tough sell. I don't see what industry is out there that's doing that kind of thing. But a really, really excellent point nonetheless. Dave, I want to get into, aside from the cultural stuff as well, this government has been beset by some scandals, AHS spending scandals. Was just wondering, can you give a better overview of what the hell has happened than I can? Because it's again, in the classic soap opera nature of Alberta politics, it's complicated.
I was going to say it's complicated.
It's complicated. And you kind of have to have been following for the last season or two, or this whole section might be a little lost on you. But can you offer us the narrator's summary, the recap, if you will?
Okay. I'm going to try to do this without unintentionally opening myself up to libel or defamation charges. Essentially, because there are a lot of people also getting sued in this whole thing.
Well, don't worry, we've got libel lawyers.
Okay,
we're
good.
Okay. We're
Perfect. Essentially, the core of it is there are serious allegations of corruption and political interference around big government contracts which appear to be started with private surgical centers. Now, this UCP government has been really focused on opening up and allowing doctors to open up private, they call them chartered surgical facilities, but they're essentially private companies that run surgical surgery centers. And you see a few of them. There's one in South Edmonton, and there's a few around Calgary. Some of the allegations were made around that, that preferential costs or preferential contracts business was being given to one company in particular. There were allegations made by the former CEO of Alberta Health Services, who was fired, and she claims that she was fired, and this is currently before the courts because she's suing the Alberta government and is being countersued by the Premier's former chief of staff. See, it's really simple. It's not complicated at all. But the allegations is that she was fired because she was going to bring some of her concerns about some of these contracts and political interference, or what she saw as political interference, to the Auditor General, and that she was fired. I think the day she alleges she was fired the day or two before she was going to meet with the Auditor General about these. So now there are and then of course there are business figures who are involved in this who have connections to the $90 million Turkish children's Tylenol fiasco, and there's skybox tickets to the Edmonton Oilers playoff run last year, which is probably a big reason why you're not seeing Danielle Smith taking her selfies of herself in skyboxes during the Oilers run this time around. And there's a whole web of political figures involved that go from the Premier's former chief of staff to the Minister of Justice, who happens to be a cousin of the guy who's involved at the center of this.
I didn't know that detail. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So,
That's problematic.
And hats off to Alana Smith and Carrie Tate at the Globe and Mail, who have just done an incredible job.
Human's work. Yep.
Incredible investigative journalism, and good for the Globe and Mail for backing them up, because they've really pieced this together. And I encourage folks to go to the Globe and Mail website and just type in Carrie Tate or Alana Smith, and then their bios will come up, and then the whole list of stories that they've done will be below it, and just go through it, because it's really remarkable. It's really, really fantastic journalism. But it's complicated, which is the thing, because there's all these figures involved. There's a lot of money, allegations around corruption, allegations around political interference. And now there's about 6 or 7 different investigations that are happening. Now, Danielle Smith resisted calls to create a public inquiry with an independent commissioner to actually hold hearings and actually investigate this. There's a third-party investigator, which is a judge or former judge from Manitoba that the Premier's office has hired to look into it. There's I think AHS is investigating. I think there's an Alberta Health investigation going on. The Auditor General is looking into some elements of this, and I believe the Ethics Commissioner is also investigating part of this. But
and I think the former AHS person who was fired is suing the government. So there's a court case in which there's more details coming out from the court case as well.
Yes, and then I believe there's a countersuit from the Premier's former chief of staff that is also part of in the mix. So this is a story that it's complicated, but it is not going away. It's, stuff will trickle out, and these investigations, just last week or the week before, the government announced that the third-party investigator was going to delay the release of his investigation until the end of September, delay his interim report until the end of September. And I think in October or November, he's going to release his full report to government.
Probably on the very day of the referendum.
Maybe. I mean, but that they have to delay it by 4 months. I mean, obviously they're kicking it down the road, but they're also, it also sends a signal that maybe there's a lot of stuff that this investigator needs to look at.
Yeah, so it's an interesting problem, because I think that people who are really, really passionately engaged in politics are watching this one much more closely even than the referendum stuff, because there's such a heap of stories and interesting scandals that seem to be coming out of it. Thank you for giving props to Carrie Tate and Alana Smith. They are doing yeoman's work on this. They've done some really, really fascinating breaks. And it seems like every week there's a new one in this one. The problem with this story is that it's also very much a slow burn kind of a story.
Yeah.
It's a drip, 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 which will either ultimately lead into something just absolutely overwhelmingly damning about how this has all been managed, or people will just become immune to it.
Yeah.
Right? They just they'll tune it out, be like, yeah, well, all governments are corrupt, so whatever. And this was one thing that I always found when I was covering the PCs, especially the last few years of the PCs, that people didn't really care about corruption. They didn't really give a shit. So long as things were going well for them, if the government, whatever, was engaged in something that maybe they shouldn't have been, whatever. I got mine. But it seemed to be that when things started to go pear-shaped economically and people were starting to feel that was when all of a sudden the idea of people in power being on the take, that became intolerable. Mm-hmm. That was kind of my perception of the shift, and I think that was also part of why the NDP finally was able to break the hold of the PC party.
Oh, for sure. 2012 to 2014 was just it was a heydays in Alberta politics. It was just a scandal a week with the PC government during that period, and some very strange travel scandals and very strange scandals around the use of government jets for private personal purposes. So these were pretty clear kind of scandals that people could see pretty clearly what was going on. And you said when economic times are bad, maybe people may pay more attention. But I think the scandals, years of scandals mixed with the total collapse of the international price of oil in 2014 absolutely contributed to the NDP winning in 2015, because Albertans were not only were they sick of the scandals and sick of the fiascos, but then they were also asking the question of, when Jim Prentice presented his first budget, which was a budget that made no one happy on the right or the left, Albertans were left asking, well, where did all the money go? We were just last year, the past couple of years, we've just been rolling in the dough, and then all of a sudden the price of oil drops and then we're poor. And that is the story of governments in Alberta, because we are so over-reliant on money collected through resource royalties to fund the day-to-day operations of government. So we don't actually collect enough taxes in Alberta, personal or corporate taxes, to actually fund government. We rely so heavily on resource royalties to do that.
But that's what allows us to run up our public spending without any kind of break, and then still consider ourselves conservative, Dave.
Well, it's having your cake and eating it too. It's the greatest combination, right? It's you get to have all the great public services, and you get to have fun stuff and nice stuff, but then you don't have to pay the big taxes for it. But
yeah, it's perfect. I said you can have all of the benefits of the socialism, but then you also get to pretend that you're a conservative. See?
Yes,
it's amazing. It's a great combination if you can get it. Look, in the midst of all this, we've got to my mind, we've got a premier who's playing footsie with stuff she shouldn't be playing footsie with. She should be absolutely putting the kibosh on the Western separatism stuff. We've got, the populist separatist dragon rearing its head, and we don't know where that's going to go. Could also just fizzle out.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the other thing too. Like this could all be over by September.
Well,
I don't know.
It could all be over by June 23rd. I mean, there's the three by-elections that are happening in Alberta right now. I mean, the one that a lot of people are paying attention to is the one in Old Didsbury Three Hills, because the Republican Separatist Party is running their leader, who's a former UCP organizer, who is a name that, if people remember the kamikaze scandal from the 2017 UCP, for the UCP leadership race, he was a key player in that.
Cam Davies.
Yeah.
He was a key player in all that. And if you want to look at that, go look at my name at McLean's.
There you go.
Because got to reveal some of that at that time. So that's interesting. So we'll take some cues about where this is all going during the by-elections. I think that if Carney manages to keep the current tone and match that tone with actual deliverables, we might be out of the woods. Or maybe not. I don't know. I was very funny the other day is that there's a guy next to my house who has the big, black fuck, used to have the big black fuck Trudeau tag or flag on his balcony.
Oh yeah.
And he managed to switch it from fuck Trudeau to fuck Carney before the election was over. He had foresight. He had purchased the fuck Carney flag on Amazon. I'm sure before Mark Carney was even prime minister. That was ready to go. So there are some people obviously who will never forgive the Liberals for being Liberals, and hey, fair enough. But I do think that even in Alberta, people are noticing a tone shift.
Yeah,
I notice a tone shift. At a minimum, I notice a tone shift.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of Albertans, even if they didn't vote Liberal in the last federal election, even if they don't really like the Liberals, I think a lot of people are willing to give Mark Carney a chance and see what this guy is about and see what he can deliver. I mean, it's clear, the minute Mark Carney walked onto the political stage as a candidate in Canada, I mean, it's very clear this is a serious guy. He's an adult, the adult in the room. He's a serious person. You're not going to see the theatrics and the performative politics of the Trudeau era, at least not yet. And I think a lot of people are willing to give him a chance. I think Carney in particular, because he's from Alberta originally. I mean, he was born in the Northwest Territories, but he grew up in Edmonton and lived in Edmonton until he went off to university. So I think that he might be uniquely positioned to have an actual understanding of Alberta in a way that previous Liberal prime ministers don't. Not to say that the Liberals are going to win a dozen seats in Alberta in the next election. Don't think that's going to happen, but it could mark a real political shift.
Yeah, which brings me to my last question, and of course, this is the reason why I dragged poor Dave onto a problematic right-wing conservative podcast. I'm forcing him to answer for his people. Dave, where's Naheed Nenshi?
Well, Naheed Nenshi's been leader of the Alberta NDP for almost a year now. So he's being leader of the Alberta NDP.
For a year. Wow, that time went by.
It did go by.
We have the UCP in serious scandal week territory. We've got a weird separatist weirdness happening specifically on the right in Alberta. Seems to me like there's a real opening for someone like Naheed Nenshi to capitalize on the opportunities that are currently arising in the political scene. And yet I think you noted in your blog, the latest polls show that not only is he not capitalizing on this particular situation, but the UCP is more popular now by several points than it was several months ago. How you proggies no do politics good?
Well, this is Alberta, but no, I think that's a big question that a lot of people are asking. And I mean, I was at the NDP. Now, first of all, I'm not a member of the NDP. I've never been a member of the NDP. I'm a progressive political writer.
Well, yes, you're just a tiny bit communist. It's fine. We won't hold it against you.
But I was at the NDP convention a few weeks ago as a media observer, and people seemed fairly happy with Naheed Nenshi. He received a huge endorsement in the leadership vote. He got about 89% in the leadership review. But these polls show that there's something that the NDP isn't doing right, and they need to take it seriously. We are
maybe 2 years from the next election. I mean, if I'm the governing Conservative Party and I'm looking at these polls going into next year, I'm going to be I would seriously be thinking about calling an election a year early to capitalize on it. But I think a lot of progressives and a lot of New Democrats are, even if they're happy with Nenshi, the choice that they made a year ago when he won the NDP leadership race, they're going to ask, well, where did the momentum go? Because it did seem when he won the NDP leadership, he won it with a huge landslide. I think he had like 60 or 80,000 votes. It was a huge landslide, unheard of for an NDP leadership race or for a non-conservative leadership race in Alberta. But it's clear that what the NDP are doing now, as much as people pay attention to politics electoral politics in between elections, but what they're doing now, probably it doesn't seem like it's working, and they seriously need to look at what they're doing. And right now, Naheed Nenshi, he's running in a by-election in Edmonton, Strathcona. He's going to win that by-election. That's a very safe NDP seat, and when he's elected to the legislature, they'll have caucus resources that they can use for him. But that doesn't really explain the past year, how he's been kind of not off the grid. He's been around, but he hasn't really been front and center as he was during the NDP leadership race. And I think part of that is, he needs to, it might just be, he just needs to hustle more. When you're the mayor of Calgary, which Naheed Nenshi was for 12 years, anytime you wanted to say something or go out and speak to the media would be there and would report what he said. And being the leader of the official opposition, it takes a little bit more effort. So, he's going to have to go out there and put maybe put a little bit more effort into getting his message out and think about what they're focusing on as a party. And are they focusing on things that are actually resonating with Albertans? I mean, I wrote in my piece this week or last week that, if I were Nenshi or NDP MLAs, that they should wake up every morning and start the day asking themselves, how can we make life more affordable for working class Alberta families? And then they should spend the rest of the day talking about it all the time. I mean, affordability is one of the biggest issues on the minds of Albertans, on Canadians right now. And, why that isn't a key part of their talking point every single day, and why they aren't talking about how, doing politics and talking about how Danielle Smith is making life unaffordable for Albertans is really beyond me. And maybe we'll see a shift when Nenshi is elected to the legislature in a couple of weeks. But there are some things that they can do. I think that during the leadership race, Nenshi, he had a lot of energy and he had a lot of momentum with town halls that they were doing across the province. And, perhaps, this summer returning to, a town hall schedule could help kind of boost or re-spark some of that momentum that he'd had. I mean, there's no doubt that the UCP basically delaying the by-election in Edmonton, Strathcona by 6 months was on purpose to keep Nenshi out of the legislature in the spring. But
and it was super bitter too. But who cares?
Yeah. No, he should. I mean, he should be out there. He should. He has a huge social media platform that he developed, that he grew as mayor. And I don't get the impression that he's really been using it as effectively as he could.
He has, name recognition you can't buy.
Yeah.
He has a huge social media platform. Here's the thing that I would observe, and this is, I think, indicative of the respective sort of information spheres that we're in, because I'm obviously not in a progressive information sphere in Alberta. It's not that I don't spend some time looking for stuff, but it's not the stuff that I'm naturally coming into. And I will tell you, the second the leadership race was over, Nenshi disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
Did not see him, does not show up in my feeds. Algorithmically, he's been unpersoned, is what it almost feels like. I think that unless you are already in the NDP information sphere and you are getting actively targeted through ads, if you're getting actively targeted through ordinary partisan networks, that maybe you have a different experience of Nenshi, and that would explain to me why the party membership is happy with him.
Mm-hmm.
But if you are not already on the bus, he's gone. He's not there. And the only thing I can remember Nenshi saying or doing in the last year is I remember him doing one interview on the CBC, basically did a very strong interview saying something to the effect of, the separatists will win over my dead body kind of thing. I can't remember a single policy he's proposed.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember a single event he's done. And I'm a pretty, reasonably politically engaged, albeit sort of more suburban Calgary conservative-ish sort of woman. And I don't mean to be grandiose or a dick about it, but there's no path to victory unless it's cutting through suburban Calgary, man,
mm-hmm.
for the NDP. Where are you, my dude?
Mm-hmm.
And with the separatism stuff in particular, there is such an opportunity for him to galvanize those kinds of like mid-centrist type people who are not keen on this idea at all. And by the way, I know lots of people who are UCP supporters, or I know lots of people who are sort of more conservative leaning, who absolutely will vote on this issue, and they'll vote against the UCP on this issue. There is a path for him to form a coalition here if he can come across as a reasonable, centrist guy, which he is. But not if he's not showing up, not if we don't see him, not if he's not around. And, you made this point. I'm going to borrow your own point for you that we were talking before the podcast, is like, Nenshi is not around. You know who's not refusing any media requests? Well, I'm going to steal it. I don't know if I was waiting. I was giving you the opening here.
That was my cue. No, Danielle Smith.
Danielle Smith's everywhere.
She's everywhere. She's
everywhere. Yeah. She's on Hurly-Burly. She does everything. I mean, I think she says yes to just about everything. And as a result, she is omnipresent. And that is the level, and she is up the premier, and she's engaging in more hustle than the Alberta opposition leader is what that feels like. If you're Nenshi, you should never be saying no to an interview request. There is no for you.
Yeah.
Right? So, I don't know. This is just, it seems to me so ridiculous that in a situation where we have governments engaging in some of the stuff that it's engaging in right now, that we seem to have gone back to the bad old days of no credible, viable opposition, no credible, viable alternative to government.
I don't know that we have no credible, viable alternative to government. I mean, we started the show talking about 20 years ago when I started in Alberta politics. And when I started in Alberta, writing about Alberta politics, I worked in Alberta politics for a while. I worked for the Liberal Party when they were the official opposition at the legislature with 15 or so MLAs. And, the idea that the official opposition in Alberta could have 38 MLAs, and the idea that the official opposition could even get more than 30% of the vote, was almost, it wasn't unthinkable, but it was laughable almost at that point because, that just didn't exist. So, the NDP under Nenshi, they need to define themselves. They need to show Albertans what they stand for. What's the difference between a Nenshi led NDP and a Notley-led NDP? Because I think a lot of Albertans know what a Notley NDP government or led NDP was, for better or for worse, but Notley had a lot of supporters across the province. What does a Nenshi NDP look like? They haven't really defined themselves, and I think there's still an opportunity, a real opportunity for them to do that. I think the next 6 months will be super critical in defining that, and super critical about Nenshi connecting with voters in Alberta, especially if there's a possibility of a referendum next year, a possibility of maybe an early provincial election next year. So they haven't run out of time yet, but the clock is ticking, and there's opportunity there, but they have to get out and take advantage of it. And I think that, there's a number of issues. I mean, like you said, appealing to moderates, moderate conservatives who don't want to separate from Canada is a big thing. That'll be a big opportunity for Nenshi if they can play, if the NDP can play their cards right, is snap that group up from the UCP. In the next election, make it about make the election and politics about your issues. I mean, Danielle Smith is absolutely fantastic. She's so skilled at defining issues and sucking up all the political oxygen in a debate. But being the opposition, you can pick and choose what issues you want to focus on. You don't have to focus on absolutely everything. And to that point, and this is interesting because I think that's a big difference between the Notley-led NDP and the Nenshi-led NDP, is Notley's NDP they had a tendency to focus on absolutely everything, to respond to absolutely everything the government did. And they'd send out just a flurry of, a dozen press releases every single day. And they would have press conferences on every single issue. And it was just noise, and there was no focus. And it seemed like it was very much, every opposition critic wanted to have their 5 minutes every single day. And it felt like they were feeding that. It was all tactics, and it wasn't really clear what the strategy was, but it was like a lot of tactics. I don't think that obviously didn't work. With with Nenshi's NDP, it seems like they're not doing that anymore. I mean, they're not focusing on every single issue, which is probably good for an opposition because you have to define yourself, but they also haven't defined themselves yet. They haven't figured out, well, what are those 2 or 3 key issues or 3 or 4 key issues that are important to Albertans, that are the most important to Albertans and the voters you want to connect with? and then run with it and absolutely focus on those issues and make that your day every single day.
What you're suggesting is we move from a all tactics, no strategy to a no tactics, no strategy to a perhaps some tactics and strategy.
Yes, yeah, they need to find a happy medium, which I don't think they've found that happy medium yet. But obviously, Nenshi's a smart guy. He's surrounded himself with smart people, and they just need to start doing politics because the election is coming quick.
Agreed. I think that the NDP needs to step up and start doing politics also, being a political party. Dave, I have found this conversation delightful. Thank you so much for explaining Alberta politics to us. It's fantastic to have you on, and we'd love to have you on again. This was a super, super excellent conversation. So thank you so much for taking some time out of your day, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jen. It's been a real absolute pleasure. I love talking about Alberta politics. It's a pleasure to talk with Alberta politics with you. And I love the podcast. I'm really a fan of what you're doing at The Line. You're doing great work.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm also a big fan of Dave Berta. So I actually avoid listening to podcasts as much as possible because I'm more of a reader than I am a listener.
Yeah.
So I'm a very diligent reader, but I never listen to anybody else's podcast. I don't listen to my own podcast either. I have no idea what I'm saying half the time. But no, as I said, really great to have you on, and I'm glad we had you on the show. Cheers.